I see we have a class of students who are joining us. So this is absolutely wonderful. So yes, welcome to our third webinar. And this time we'll be talking about collecting data with and about young children, ethical and methodological issues. And just as a way of introduction to our body or our group of researchers, is that the Multilingual Childhoods Network brings together researchers who are investigating the learning of 2 or more languages in the home, school or community by children. But uniquely, we focus on children from birth to the age of 6, which is an area that's sometimes covered and sometimes not covered, but we particularly focus on children of between these ages. And we're interested in all aspects of first language, second language development, in context of awareness of languages, additional languages, foreign languages, second languages, or, of course, bilingual and immersion education. So anything surrounding early childhood experiences of multilingualism are welcome, and this is what we're interested in. And we hope that after this webinar that you'd be happy to join our network and we'd continue in this good and important work, if you like. So finally, I just want to say that Multilingual Matters has been very generous with us and offered 50% discount on all or any books in the series Early Language Learning in School Contexts, and this is edited by Janet Aneva and Dr. Anna Maria Pinter. Post this webinar, I will be emailing you this link and the poster so that you know exactly where to go. I will also be emailing you a feedback form, and we'd really appreciate your thoughts on how the webinar went, so we can obviously improve next time and so on. I should also just say to some of our colleagues who have joined, good morning, good afternoon, and we had colleagues from Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, and China who couldn't join, but will definitely be keen to receive the recording. So I just want to say hello to them in advance, and that although you're not here, we are thinking of you. So what I would like to do right now is just take you through the run of events and then begin with introducing our first speaker. I should also say you are free to ask any questions in the chat box. You can send them directly to myself, or you can send them to everybody, and we'll try our best to answer the question. Oh, I see Sandy. Hello, Sandy. It's been ages. Okay. So, first we'll begin with Professor Mila, who will be talking about what can we learn from doing research with children as active agents. 10 minutes later, that will be followed by Gail Ellis's talk, how can we collect children's reflections on their learning process, followed by Dr. Mora's talk on collecting data with and about young children, ethical issues, and finally, Dr. Anna Maria, who will be talking about social and cultural norms of the different communities and ethical challenges in researching young language learners. So we can see that it's packed with all the good things related to the research at hand. I will begin first by introducing Professor Mila Schwartz, who is a professor in language and education and a head of research authority in Oranim Academic College of Education in Israel. And she has over 20 years experience in research related to children's language learning in home and education contexts with numerous publications. So I will hand it over to Mila, who will begin her talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this introduction and for this event. Exciting, very exciting. Can you hear me? All our participants? Okay, so let's start. And can you see my presentation? Perfect. Okay. So I will briefly, during 10 minutes, address the topic of our meeting, of my talk. My talk will focus on what we can learn from young children and doing research with young children as active agents. And I will start from my favorite definition of, very general definition of agency that was suggested by REYLL in 2010, agency as a central concept in learning. Central concept in learning, and I think it's very important to remind ourselves that agency refers to all learning domains, and not only to learning domains, also to our social life, daily interactions. We are all agents to some extent in different kinds of situations. So if we are talking about child language agency, I would like to refer to definitions that was suggested by Fatma in 2017. The child agency language use refers to the child's actions and linguistic choices performed in a given context or conversation. What was suggested in this definition, the child agency is related, or I would like to stress, maybe influenced by child's identity, culture, social ties, environment, family, and language. In terms of environment, I would like to address educational environment and family, both educational environment, preschool educational environment as a monolingual or bilingual or trilingual educational setting, and family as well. So I would like to suggest discussing notion child's language-based agency, and what do I mean under this concept of child's language-based agency. Child's language-based agency can be observed in language-based agentic behaviors. Children express their agency actively in their behaviors, and they express their agency also through their attitudes towards languages in their environment, and beliefs about languages in their environment, and how they learn them, and why do we need to learn them, and if it's important for them or not important for them to learn them. It means that I'm discussing with you both languages in environment and learning these languages, both exposure to these languages and contexts in which child is supposed or expected to learn a novel language or to maintain home or heritage language and enrich it with an educational context. What can we learn from doing research with young children as active agents? So, children's agentic beliefs are important since they mirror their hidden intentions and might influence their interest in a novel language. Children as young as 3-5 years old can explicitly dictate their language policy in the educational context. They can dictate their class matters, peers, who speaks which language, to whom and when. And definitely this active agency influences the language learning context and language use in educational context. Children can understand the importance of knowing languages, and they express this importance of knowing languages, and they're even aware that languages are communicative tools, and the more languages they are exposed to, the better. They are aware at age 3, as young as age 3, that learning languages contributes to situations in which they meet people who speak those languages. What we also know from our recent research, that children are aware that the more languages they know, the better, and they express this awareness through our interaction with them during research process. Within bilingual and multilingual context, with an environment of educational setting, early language learning education, children demonstrate an early interest in the languages itself. And today, the other speakers will address this interest as language metalinguistic awareness or language awareness. They think about languages, they develop intensively this ability to think about languages and to discuss languages with their classmates and with the teachers and parents. This awareness can be expressed by asking questions about languages, but asking for clarification, for translation, and also by awareness that some peers are not experienced in language and they need help from their more experienced, more competent peers in classroom. Children can develop a sense of language priority. This self-conscious prioritizing of the language is what we call language hierarchy. They can express that they can rate languages in their environment for more important and less important. And this rating is related to the socially more important languages, majority languages, minority languages, and other influences. Children can position themselves as language learners and users. They can position themselves as language expert, and they can be proud of this language expertise. And they can also, through positioning themselves as language expert, marginalize other peers in their environment. So the teachers need to be aware of this positioning and need to know how to use this positioning to improve language competence of peers and not to hurt other children in environment by this positioning. Actually, I'm done. Is it some time spare for me?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. So I was so afraid to have more. So I would like to summarize that children are active learners and they express their agency that is defined as movement, as interest in languages, and through their beliefs about languages, they express their agency daily by their metalinguistic questions, by their behavior as language expert, by rating languages, by inventing languages, new languages to communicate with peers, by as well refusing to use some languages, showing avoiding behavior in using some languages. And what is very important to stress in the end of my talk, that this agency is influenced by the teachers and the environment, and in particular by relationships between teachers and children, and in particular by the nature of connection between teacher and children. If we can observe attachment between teacher and child and warmth and empathy, we can observe as well children active agentic behavior. It's a very important conclusion that I came from my recent research. Thank you so much for attention. большое спасибо. شكرا كتير. تודה ربا. Thank you. Grazie mille.
Thank you so much, Mina. Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. A great start, as somebody just said in the chat, a great start to the webinar. Thank you so much. And of course, you can have your questions and ask them at the end. Okay, so we move to our second speaker, Gail Ellis, who will talk about how can we collect children's reflections on their learning process. And we're absolutely thrilled to have Gail here with us today. She is an independent teacher educator and advisor based in Paris, and her main interests are based on children's rights, picture books, primary English language teaching, young learner, English language teaching management, and inclusive practices. So I won't delay any longer, and please, Gail, you can start when you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Oh, can you all see me, hear me? Good. Thank you very much, Fatma. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's a great honor. And I send everybody virtual greetings from Paris. So the title of my talk is How Can We Collect Children's Reflections on Their Learning Processes? And I'd like to structure this talk around the following questions, because I think before we get to the how, we need to briefly consider the what, the why, and the when. And then I will end with some points that we need to take into consideration from the perspective of teachers, teacher educators, researchers, parents, and managers and administrators. And my talk is very much relevant to children aged between 3 and 6. First of all, what reflections can we collect? Well, basically anything that is related to children's learning experiences. And I've got a list here, but their learning activities, the equipment and the resources they're using, their learning space, their classroom environments, their indoor-outdoor environment, their preferences and their feelings, and of course their performance and their achievements. So why do we do this? Why do we collect reflections on children's learning processes? Well, basically I've identified what I consider to be 3 key reasons. And the first one is good pedagogical practice. Because when children are respected as active learners with agency who are capable of giving their views and making choices, this creates more questioning, curious, active learners. They become more personally involved in their learning, and they gradually develop an awareness of the learning process. Now, for the teacher or the researcher, it gives us an insight into what children think and what they like. It helps us plan next steps, and it very much supports the relationships that teachers or researchers develop with children. I think it also helps teachers become more reflective on their own practice, and it helps them recognize the child as a holder of rights. In terms of developmental benefits, to quote David Whitebread, to provide opportunities for children to talk authentically about their learning is an important component in helping them develop as self-regulating learners. This is also not just a matter of cognitive activity, but has important emotional and motivational elements, and in particular, the development of intrinsic motivation. So we can see that it contributes to children's holistic development, and it emphasizes their autonomy and ownership of their learning. It's a legally binding obligation and ethical duty. Many well-established as well as more recent approaches to the education of young children have focused on their capacities as agents in their own learning. And these approaches have informed, for example, the early years foundation stage in England, where it's quoted that practitioners should involve pupils fully in their own assessment by encouraging them to communicate about and review their own learning. So this shows that they feel that children are capable of doing this. Also, there's a link with children's rights, and in particular with Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, where in a democratic English language learning classroom, children are given opportunities to express their views and opinions about their learning, and teachers listen and act on these views and involve children in decision-making about what goes on in class. So when can we do this? Well, basically we can do this at any point throughout a learning sequence, at the beginning, during, at the end. But what is important is the fact that this is integrated, opportunities for reflection is integrated into familiar routines and also linked to concrete and specific learning experiences. Now, I've found that the high scope model of active learning provides a very useful and flexible model for integrating reflection into our teaching and learning sequences. It can be applied to whether it's full-time pre-primary education or whether in the context that I used to work in, which was out of school, where children come for 1 or 2 hours a week. And you can see that this has been applied to the kind of colourful model where it's integrated into the very specific routines that made up that time. And you can see that there's also a further stage, what we've called a home link, which is to connect the setting, the learning environment with the home. So how can we do it? So here we are moving on now to the how. Well, we can use multi-method techniques, of which there are many, but we can use these as tools to access children's views and opinions on the learning process. So down on the left side, you can see the different kinds of techniques or methods. There's drawing, there's oral accounts or physical records. For example, children may have a scrapbook or a learning book where they can keep records of their learning. Photography and film, constructing models, movement and mime, puppets such as a reviewing puppet, emoticons and visual prompts. So I'd like to take you through just a few of these in the short time. So first of all, drawing. This is a lovely example from Nayir Ibrahim, who is actually in this talk, I think. And this is where the children were asked to draw in the body of the caterpillar the different activities that took place in their lesson. And the objective was to help them realize that there are many different ways of learning English. And you can see here that we've got computers, total physical response, songs, writing, and drawing. Again, another drawing activity, what was your favorite activity today, which is the reflection prompt, and the children draw their favorite activity or activities, as we can see in the top one, flashcard, games, stretching, the garden, and songs. And here from Monica Wiltshire's book on the high scope approach, a 4-year-old who says, I played Snap, and he's drawn the Snap cards. And here's another example using metaphor elicitation, which is a research project that Nayir Ibrahim and I carried out in Paris, and which will be appearing in the July issue of the English Language Teaching Journal, where the children reflect on their views and perspectives of learning English through an English senses book. And the example here that I'm showing you is related to the sense of touch. Learning English feels like muse. And we had great difficulty understanding what the child meant by muse. But when she explained to us, she said that mousse was linked to bubbles. And then the illustration became clear that it was a bath and that the circles represented the bubbles. And she explained, learning English feels like bubbles because it's soft. And I have mousse, which is in French, mousse, which is bubble bath in English, in my bath at home with my nanny, and we speak English. And I think what's interesting here is that the child is using both English and French to express her views, and we can see examples of her early literacy development. She was 5, by the way. Emoticons are a very common technique, but just very quickly, I'd just like to say that when I use emoticons, I like to link them instead of just always using a smiley face in the shape of a face. I like to link them to the topic or the content of the lesson. And in this case, the topic of the picture book, Banana by Ed Veer, where the smiley faces are actually in bananas. This makes it more visually attractive for children. It makes it more memorable and varied. Film. This is a child who is telling us, recalling the 12 names of the animals that he learnt from the Chinese New Year. Unfortunately, I don't have time to show you the film, but he showed remarkable metacognitive knowledge and behavior, strategic control and motivation. He used his visual prompts, you can see them in his hands, they're little cards, as prompts to recall the animals, but he was also accepting verbal prompts from his peers, also from the teacher. He used error correction and self-correction to correct his own mistakes. He monitored his performance, and he resisted distraction from his peers who were very eager to he took great pride and accomplishment in recalling these 12 animal names. The tape's transcript is here. It's in the chapter co-authored with Sheila Rickson in the bibliography that I have. And I think the point that I really want to make is that this took just over a minute. And although there were 12 children in the class, they were all attentive. And I will come back to this in a minute. The next example is using a puppet. In this case, the teacher is using a reviewing puppet to get children to reenact what they liked. So the reflection prompt was, what did you like the most today? Fiona, and she says the song, and the teacher begins, or the reviewing puppet begins to sing the song, and the children in the class joined in spontaneously. So they were reviewing their favorite activity, which was the song, and they took great enjoyment in doing that. And it took 35 seconds. And here, as an example of a teacher using visual prompts in the form of routine or activity cards to create a visual timetable or a lesson menu. And she says, I show the structure of the lesson using a mix of routine cards. And at the end, we sit in a circle and I ask the children to show each other what they did and say what they enjoyed. So a very visual way of reviewing and reflecting on the learning process. So to finish, the points that I think are important to take into consideration, first of all, teachers. First of all, many teachers consider that children are too young and not capable of giving their views or opinions about the learning process. So they may be resistant to such an approach and they may not see their value, its value. So they're going to need convincing. They may also think it takes too long. It cuts into too much teaching time. But I think from the examples I've shown you that it doesn't take long at all. It takes, in fact, a very short time. But what is important is very good time management and planning to ensure that there is time for this type of activity. This approach may also require a rethinking of the power dynamics in the adult-child, teacher-child relationship, moving to one of more shared control. And teachers may need to rethink their own views about the child and the childhood and examine their beliefs and attitudes, because these impact on the type of relationships they establish with children. And in order to do this, that is to get children to reflect on their learning in an ethically appropriate manner, it's important to use a variety of multi-method techniques, make them as practical as possible, link them to specific learning experiences so that language is not a barrier. And the teacher will almost certainly need to use the children's own language to do this, especially in the initial stages. So from the educator's perspective, teachers need training and ongoing support in ways of encouraging young children to reflect on their learning. It needs to be integrated into pre and in-service teacher development. And although the theme of children's rights may appear beyond the remit of the English language teacher, an understanding of children's rights is part of the teacher's wider professional remit and ethical duty. And it's important for them to develop the skills and strategies for children to be able to exercise their rights. And as the children's own language or the shared classroom language is their default cognitive tool, teachers need training in how to use the children's own language or the shared classroom language effectively and judiciously as a resource for learning and to support learning. In terms of researchers, we need to keep in mind that pre-primary children are still very young. They have limited knowledge of the world and ability to articulate their thoughts and feelings. So we need to be careful not to dominate or to miss or over-interpret or over-read interpretations into their data. Parents need to be informed that their children will be asked to reflect on their learning, and that parents should be asked to be able to support this at home to keep the thread of learning intact from one session to the next. And they also need to understand that if the L1 is being used for this purpose, it will not distract from English language learning time or exposure to the target language. And administrators or managers will need to consider whether the teacher speaks the children's language or not, and whether they may need to provide a bilingual classroom assistant. So I think that's it, Fatma. Have I done my 10 minutes? I've got one more little thing to say if there's a minute left.
Yes, please go ahead, yes.
Okay, so I just wanted to say in terms of the research ethics that parents should be asked to give their consent for their child to participate in these different kinds of reflection activities. And children should also be asked to give their consent and ask whether they would like to participate. They should be asked in age-appropriate ways. For example, we're going to ask you to say what your favorite activity is, what you liked, what you didn't like, what you think you've learned, and so on. And they mustn't be pressurized into any aspect of the process, and their right to not participate must be respected. So there we go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That amazing, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm just thinking that personally, I have questions that I will need to ask later on. But I think your talk of using the L1 or the language that the teacher should share with the children is controversial, but also really interesting. So
Yes,
of
yes,
course,
it is.
people will definitely ask about that. Okay. Thank you so much. And now I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Moira, who will be talking about collecting data with and about young children, again, ethical issues. And she's a researcher in early childhood education and second language learning in early years. And previously, she worked as a lecturer in early childhood education and was a primary teacher and an early years practitioner and has published on these issues. So we're really in for a treat today. I mean, everyone's just amazing. So please, when you're ready.
Good afternoon to all of you from a very cool and very cloudy Dublin, but it is dry. And Díomh Galéir, and I'm delighted to be able to present to you this afternoon. Before we start, I would just like to remind us that we're talking about children here. Whether we're interested in their processes of language learning, in the pedagogical aspects of helping them acquire or enrich a second language, or if we have some other focus to our research. But we can't lose sight of the fact that we're working with children all the time. I'd like to speak very briefly this afternoon to you about 3 integrated issues. And I'm speaking on behalf of my colleague Noreen Hayes as well. The two of us have cooperated on a chapter on this theme. We're looking at the researcher's image of the child in the context of second language learning. We're looking at the nature of the language that's been undertaken, and we're looking at the researcher's understanding of ethics. So today's talk will take the form of a series of questions, and depending on time, we may have time to discuss an ethical dilemma at the end. My own experience, as Fatma have said, is as a researcher, but it's in a minority or a heritage language, the Irish language, and my work has taken place mainly in early total immersion settings. So the first image here is the first point here is the image of the child. How do we view children? You've had some ideas already this afternoon from Gail and from Mila. But many authors in the field question if researchers really view children as competent and confident in forming their own views, in expressing these views about their language learning experiences in our case, or do we see them merely as more passive recipients of our interventions? Will the research methods connect with their previous experiences? Or will we be making new demands on them and then forming judgments based on these demands? Balancing act again, we shouldn't underestimate children's abilities as well. But at the early stages of second language acquisition, I think we need to be mindful of these demands. Researchers always struggle with time, and it's really important to make every effort to make time for familiarization to be built in. Time for the children, for the staff, and for the researcher to form professional relationships within the setting, and for the researcher to understand the norms and practices of the early childhood setting, to observe in particular the second language learning strategies that are there. For example, are they interested in translanguaging, or is it to be completely in the target language? What are the children used to, and if what you're proposing will be new to them or not? Others make very interesting points about the connections between lip service to children's voices and the realization of children's rights, as Gail has been talking about in the last talk there. Lundy says we really need to go way beyond paying this token lip service to children's voices and try to enact children's rights to be listened to be acknowledged, and to be responded to. And as Mila was saying at the end of her talk, sometimes these are very welcome responses with engagement and interest and children's initiatives. Sometimes they can show that they're not really interested in what we want them to do. It's a problem for research, but children's rights trump the researchers' priorities, and children should be responded to and not followed into secret hiding places or not recorded if they have expressed a wish that they don't want this to take place. Obviously, informed consent, as far as it can be done, is a really important point in research. It's a very challenging concept for all young children in their first language, let alone a second language. And of course, gatekeepers must be involved. If we're in an early childhood setting, it's the classroom educator, practitioner, teacher, whatever term is used, and the children's parents. But it's also important to try and explain the project to the child in a way that's appropriate for their understanding, using perhaps mime, showing them your recording equipment, miming, writing down in a big book, etc. And what we are hoping to provide here is the ability for children to give their assent, which is limited understanding. It's beyond their life experience to talk about the implications or the consequences of the research in many cases. A point that's come to the fore in more recent time is looking at trying to obtain and negotiate children's ongoing consent. If we're there for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, even longer, children's interest may wax and wane, but we should always try and get ongoing consent and look at the verbal and the non-verbal engagement and disengagement as well. Skoneforth talks about having an ethical radar and being looking out for ways that the children are displaying their interest or lack thereof within the project. The nature of the research is another important point here. Research can take many forms: quantitative, qualitative, a lot less quantitative at the moment as far as we can see, participatory and non-participatory on the part of the researcher. Are you a non-participant observer? Are you an active participant in the activities of the setting? And it also applies to the children, whether they will have a very active role in deciding, for example, what questions they'd like to discuss, what activities they'd like to do, etc., or not. All of them have a value of their own. The children themselves, how are they selected? Does the researcher select them? Does she ask the educator for advice to select talkative children, for example, compliant children, enthusiastic children? Or is it going to be more of a group observation? And what level of participation do we wish them to offer there as well? Anna Maria has written quite some time ago that there were relatively limited numbers of applied linguistic studies that were taking children's views into consideration. They have increased slightly since this was published, 6 years ago now, but there are still, far more observational studies than ones that have included noting children's views. These views are taken into consideration to a much greater degree in early childhood education, the sociology of childhood, childhood studies, ethnography, and many more. It's interesting, in fact, to see the increase of ethnographic studies that are coming to the fore right now. As people who are interested in languages, we need to consider how language issues are embedded in our research design, in our methodologies, in the sources that we use. Are we, for example, only looking at sources in English coming from particular English-speaking countries? We've already have examples here, I'm drawing on French language sources, etc. And how do we present our publications? Again, are they being published only in the mainstream language? Are they being published in a minority or a heritage language? Are they being published in academic form, or are they offered in more accessible forms? These are all important aspects that should be thought through at the beginning. And the last point then that we're looking at on this slide is there a match between the researcher's background and her experience and those of the participants? We're talking here about discipline background. Are they practitioners? Are they speakers of the target or the minority language? Or do they work through an intermediary? Access may or may not to an early year setting may be dependent on speaking the target language. That will give rise in itself to quite a number of interesting issues. The researcher herself, and I'm using herself because it is most often women, but of course men operate in the field as well. Are we talking about a continuum here, going beyond from an insider perspective to an outsider perspective? And we need to consider the effect this will have on the data collection, the language we use with interviews with staff, the consultation with parents, for example. Other issues that occur in all sorts of research then will come into play, like power and identity. Are you presenting yourself as somebody who has a relationship with the field? Or have you been a practitioner? Are you an academic? Are you a parent? And how will this affect the relationship you will have with the staff, with the parents, and of course, with the children? Our understanding of ethics permeates all of our work here. And I think the basic question is, are we going to go beyond the remits and requirements of ethics committees, or are we going to have our ethical radar extended and try to respect in very live ways the integrity, the dignity, and the autonomy of the participants, who can leave at any time if they wish? Hendrickson and Lofdahl talk about ethics as, wait, can I just find my page here? As they talk about ethics as research practice, or ethics as research risk reduction. And there's the world of a difference between the two of them, and we should definitely try to guard against ethical drift towards the risk reduction side of the equation. We should, of course, be examining the reasons why we choose our various methodologies. Does this offer agency to children? And try to think ahead to possible ethical dilemmas. The idea of using the same general principles with children as we do with adults is one that has been discussed at length by various researchers in the field. And Christensen and Prout advise that we make adjustments to suit the concrete situation of particular children or groups of children, and that these adaptations are based then on children's experiences, on their interests, on their everyday routine. You know, what right do we have to change their everyday routine to a considerable degree? And of course, we should pay attention to children's emotions. If they feel stressed by being observed, if they wish to be more independent, etc. Confidentiality and anonymity are, of course, part of the remit of ethics, but they take on a renewed importance if we're dealing with a small community of practice, example, early ed field, or if we're talking about a particular location where people would know a great deal about personal lives of people, and we should try to maintain their anonymity as far as is possible. To summarize, we are looking in our consideration of ethical issues at the influences of languages and language on the totality of the research process, the design, the way we collect data, the sources we use, and how we present the results of our research. Do we, for example, give feedback to those that have helped us and have facilitated data collection? And if so, in what form? Issues of power and adult to child, adult to adult, adult in relation to the institutions that we're working with, all affect the relationships between the people as well. Do we have particular affiliations with the theme, with the topic, with the discipline, with the language, and how can this be acknowledged? We should be looking at trying to tap into children's second language learning experiences and their competencies in the context, because particularly at the early stages of second language learning, second language acquisition, language will be learned in a particular context. If we try and go beyond that, we may be asking more than the children can handle easily. Our methodologies should make sense to children. This is their life, this is their day. It has to make sense to them. And we're always reminded of Margaret Donaldson's work on children's minds, about how children strive very hard to make sense of whatever research experience is presented to them. Whether that's possible or not is the other matter. And finally then, it is important to make time for the relationships to grow between the adults and the children, and for these relationships to come to an end, usually by trying to share the results of the research that they have helped us acquire. So I'll hand you back now to Fatma. Thank you very much. Are we okay for time there, Fatma?
Thank you so much, Moira. That was absolutely interesting. I mean, each talk keeps making my mind go places. So I think that definitely some of my current projects will need a look in terms of children's rights. All of a sudden, I feel like, oh my God, I didn't take these things into consideration. So it's really, really helpful. Absolutely. I couldn't tell you stop.
Thank you.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much. I should say that the video is recorded and we will be sharing this on the website and hopefully through our YouTube video on YouTube soon. So thank you. Okay, so we go to the end, to our last speaker who's been patiently waiting and whose topic is also exciting me. So I have the great pleasure of introducing our final speaker, Dr. Anna Maria Pinter. And she'll be talking about social and cultural norms of the different communities and ethical challenges in researching young language learners. She is a reader at the Department of Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick in the UK, and her research interests focus on all aspects of second, foreign language education for children, task-based second language teaching, and learning and engaging children actively. And as we know, she's published widely and given conference talks on this topic. So thank you so much, and please, Anna Maria, when you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much, Fatma. Can you all hear me? I assume everyone can hear me and everyone can hopefully see my screen as well. So yes, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar, which I have enjoyed tremendously. And I need to apologize straight away, because those of you who know my work a little bit, you might know that my area of expertise is not with preschool children so much. All my hands-on experience with research as well as teaching and training has been with slightly older children. So I apologize for that, but I think what I'm going to say today is in very global terms applicable to all children, whether they are younger or older. And I'm going to try and draw a couple of experiences on with children that were at a younger age group as opposed to older. So I'm focusing on social and cultural norms, and this is something that Fatma asked me in particular to focus on. And I'm going to kind of just tell you a little bit about experiences that I have had where I saw the relevance of social and cultural norms in terms of the big questions of ethics working with children. So my interest in researching with children, and I put with in red here, because this is something that I'm really passionate about and have become a great believer in. So all research that I intend to do in the future with children will be with the active involvement of children, if that's at all possible. And I guess going back many, many years, if I reflect on it now, 25 years ago, when I did my experimental study for my PhD in task-based learning, I remember that the children, when we finished the tasks, on the corridor during their break time, they used to draw tasks for each other, and they used to enthusiastically practice with the tasks that I presented in my experimental design. And at the time, I was really scared, thinking that what were they doing? They were doing something that wasn't part of my experiment. But thinking back, what was happening is that they were just exercising their agency. They enjoyed working with those tasks, and they wanted to do more of them. And this is very typical of children. If they enjoy something, they will want to do more, and they will kind of design their own activities, if you like, in their own time to continue. I also noticed in my practice that if you give just a little bit of choice to children, then they will be more keen to get on with the learning task. So I got interested in the autonomy literature and the learning strategies literature, and all this kind of eventually brought me to my big passion, which is researching with children and involving them in active roles. Here, by the way, I've got a picture of much older kids. They're 9, 10-year-old children who, what they're doing here is they are analyzing the results of their questionnaire study and preparing a presentation on screen. Of course, I'm not suggesting that this should be possible with preschool children, but just to give you a context of the kind of work I've been doing. So here I'm just going to talk a little bit about the background, and luckily the other speakers have already covered some of this, so I will go really fast. So the move in the literature, both within our field and outside, has been happening from research on children to research with children, and even by children, if you like. And the political impetus behind this is the United Nations document that the previous speakers already talked about, emphasizing the children's rights. The epistemological impetus is the standpoint research argument, which basically just says that as adult educators, teachers, teacher trainers, researchers, basically we have no chance of fully understanding the children from our point of view. So we need to make every effort to somehow access their point of view. And then, of course, the methodological impetus, which is about reducing the power gap between adults and children, and experimenting with all kinds of more democratic ways of researching and more participatory ways of researching, using drama and drawings and photography and these kinds of wonderful ideas. So some of the key concepts that have emerged from here are voice, agency, and participation. And in the early literature, these were kind of heralded as very romantic ideas that need to be embraced just because they are useful and beneficial in their own right. At the same time, of course, critical voices are growing as well. And this already shows us that the macro context is very, very important in research. So essentially, the argument that the rights-based approach is a very Western approach that is not something that certain traditions and certain educational philosophies can embrace. And not everywhere will teachers and parents and school authorities agree with this, or have philosophies and educational practices in place to align themselves with this rights-based idea. So if a particular context where we're planning the research is very sort of against this idea, and there are no seeds or antecedents of this kind of way of working with children, this is going to make the researcher's job very, very difficult. And you could argue that it would be downright wrong or perhaps unethical to impose your way of looking at children in a particular context where they're not being looked at in the same way. So going from these more romantic ideals that agency and voice are good for their own sake, I think people have started to reflect much more on the role of the context. So agency obviously cannot just be simply handed over like a product, but it is something that is constrained in any context. So even if you invite children to participate in absolutely everything in your research, they'll be constrained by lots of things, by their own knowledge, by the expectations that they might have of what you want them to do, by the resources available, but also by how often and for how long they're invited to participate. If this is a one-off opportunity that will not happen for a long time, obviously it loses significance. And while a lot of people earlier used to say child voice, we need to look for the child voice that is authentic, there is now a realization there's no such thing as authentic child voice, because children will tell different things to different people, different adults in different situations. So basically all this, I think, points to the importance of the context, both the macro context and the micro context. So what goes on in the school, what goes on in the family and in the communities will be a very important factor in how the children will receive this invitation to be part of the research. And of course, within the school, we can go beyond that. We can go and look at the curriculum, the philosophy of education, the adults' view of childhood, how they conceptualize it. These are things that Moira's just been talking about. So all these will affect to what extent the children will be able to actually get involved actively in the project, and what kind of sense they make of you as a researcher, who they think you are and what you think your agenda is. And this is where the time spent with them working on that relationship and understanding of each other's agendas is very important. So children's voices are important and we need to carry on trying to elicit them, but their voices and stories are always embedded in interactional, institutional, social, and local discourses. And of course, that also means sometimes a child tells you something, it may just be a replica of whatever they heard at home. So their voices are always multi-layered. So I've got some very personal reflections from a project in India that I was involved in for over a year. And this particular project was very exciting to me because it was all focused on working with teachers who would then try and encourage their learners to be active participants in their action research. What happened here, the youngest children here were actually as young as 6 or 7 years old, but there were much older children as well. What happened here, that for over a year, the teachers were experimenting with ideas in their classrooms, involving the children to make decisions, to choose activities and materials, to design materials for each other. And in the picture, actually, you can see some children who are researching their own practice, tallying the results from a little survey they just undertook in their own classroom. So what I want to just very briefly do here is reflect on some of the ethical issues from a social contextual point of view, actually. The teachers were saying that they were really enjoying this work, and the children were also absolutely enjoying the work. And they noticed remarkable changes in their classroom, that the children were more engaged, more motivated, participated, more eagerly worked and collaborated in groups much better, and had a ton of wonderful ideas. And so the teachers suddenly realized, gosh, we underestimated these children for such a long time. But actually, the longitudinal design of the study caused quite a lot of ethical issues and problems. The children begin to ask questions like, why is it that we do this kind of work in English and not in other subject areas? Why can't we do this with the other teachers as well in science and in maths? And this is actually an issue that is very, very important and can be very, very serious in terms of individual teachers undertaking this kind of work. Once the children get a taste for it, there is really no way back. You can't go back to old ways of teaching and learning. And I'm afraid after the project ran out, that's what happened to some of the children. They moved on to another class or even to another school, and they were faced with rote learning and everything being exactly the same as it was before. So it's a hugely interesting and grave ethical concern, actually. What happens to the project afterwards? What happens to the children afterwards? Should that be a concern of the outsider researcher who is actually coming into this school to set up a project like that? And we now realize that it would have probably been much better to involve whole school approach. So all the teachers from the school, rather than various different teachers from different schools, because at least a whole school approach partially solved this problem. We also had very complicated issues with regard to gaining consent. Some of the children's parents were not literate enough to give us consent, and we had to deal with this dilemma. What do we do? Do we then exclude those children who would love to participate, but their parents weren't able to sign a consent form? Or do we include them anyway? And we're breaking a major ethical rule, which is about having access to the children via the gatekeepers, the parents, the guardians. Also, the children were in active roles. Sometimes they were interviewing their peers and things like that. So they were not just objects of the research, but they were also active researchers in their own right. So this dual role gives you a huge dilemma as to what kind of consent you're actually going to negotiate with them. And we also experienced professional jealousy from other colleagues. So some of these teachers who participated in the project were a little bit, I wouldn't say ostracized, but they were kind of looked upon as becoming slightly different to the rest of the teachers in the school. And this, again, if you look at it from a macro perspective, causes us to notice another ethical dilemma. So just to wrap up, I think I think research with children in schools is still something that we should try to do as much as possible. And we can have insiders and outsiders as adult researchers to initiate this. Of course, if you're an insider, you already know the children really well. You have got a huge advantage with regard to relationship building. If you're an outsider, you have more work to do in that area. But whether you're an insider or an outsider, I think doing this kind of work, you need to really explore and study and think about the research site and think about the social norms, the curricula, the underlying philosophies. And if possible, and you're an outsider, you should also undertake some initial observations to understand the micro context as well as possible. And I think reflexivity is important. Now, this has been defined by different people in different ways. For me, the main things in reflexivity is to be very conscious of our adult biases. We all have biases. We can never get rid of our biases, and in some sense, we don't need to, because it's a battle that we will never win. However, we need to constantly think about our biases. We need to constantly question our assumptions, and we need to accept that children's voices are messy and in some cases multi-layered, and they need to be very carefully analyzed in their social, cultural micro context. So this is all I had planned. I haven't included any references. I've got very many. So if someone wants to email me for particular references, you're very welcome. And I would just like to finish by showing you this flyer one more time. I know Fatma already has done this, but she's asked me to mention it at the end of my talk as well. Very generously, Multilingual Matters have offered a 50% discount on all the books that appear in the series. This is the code to use, but you can find the code as well in the actual flyer in the red part at the bottom. And just one final word about the book that is coming out soon, edited by myself and Harry Kuchar, who's at Leeds University. And this book looks at ethical and methodological dilemmas in early language learning research with children. And there are some wonderful contributions in this book from a range of different scholars. And for example, Gail is in the book. Gail and Nair together have written, and many others. So I really hope that some of you might get the chance to look at that at some point. So I'll stop here. I'm sure I've been more than 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. That was another dimension to the talk. I think everybody watching probably thinks we rehearsed this, but we promise we didn't. I mean, the talks just fell so well into place. You'd imagine that we said, you say this, and then the next speaker will say this, but it didn't happen that way. I think we started in a really nice, general way with children's voices, and they are legitimate participants who we can understand, who have views and opinions and ideologies about language. And then we moved on to the rights of children, and I think that was explained so well in the talks by Gail and Moira, really well, making us as researchers, I think, rethink some of the things that we're already doing, or some of the future projects that we will be doing. And then Anna Maria came with a kind of closing it from the teacher perspective, the school perspective. So it started wide, and then it went narrow, and then it went wide again, and it's just amazing. So if I've learnt a lot, I'm imagining everyone else did. So we'll open the floor for questions now. And we have about half an hour. So please feel free to ask any questions you'd like. I think we're fine to use the mic. Or you can type the questions into myself or Beatrice. I can't find Beatrice here, but Beatrice is here as well. So if you'd like to send to myself or Beatrice, that would be fine. Questions? Comments? Okay, I suppose I had one question, and this is for all the speakers, and anybody could answer this. And that's to do with the perception of children's rights in different cultures. Sometimes you go to collect data, and you emphasize that children must be told about the process of data collection and so on. And sometimes parents don't see it as a necessity to even inform their children. What do we do as researchers in this situation? Because we want to be ethically correct, but we also want to give children all their rights. So how do we overcome this? anyone.
Based on your contribution to the handbook, I think you have in Mayra.
Yeah.
Can you address this question, please?
I think that that's a really interesting question, because that's a situation that we can often find to some extent or another. Of course, we have to talk to parents. There's no question about that. But there's also no question that we have to try and explain it to children. And I think we can explain to parents that we want to find out what children think. And in order to find that out, we have to ask then a number of questions with their assent. And we can phrase that in a way that is appropriate for the circumstances. What I think parents might feel is that they might be trying to help us and sometimes over trying to assist us. Sometimes either, that's because of their own feeling or their own wish to be on very good terms with the educator or the teacher. So I think we have to be sensitive in how we handle it. But I think explaining your own position is the starting point, and then trying to explain to children. I mean, we've read about incidents in the literature where the parent will give consent, but the child is just not interested, and that's their right. I always feel we're sort of in a similar position to a guest when we enter into a research setting, and that we have to behave respectfully as a guest towards the children and the staff that we're working with. And if a child shows that he or she is not interested, Mila, you've described this in some of your more recent articles there. We can see, okay, we try and go somewhere else. Again, I was quite taken aback at an earlier stage in my career when I realized that if we give children their rights, we give them the right to leave the research setting physically and spiritually and mentally. So it's always wise to have a much larger sample group in mind, so that you have people that you can call on if the occasion occurs. I had the opposite experience at one point where I had worked with a practitioner. We'd worked out criteria for selecting children, and it did include being talkative, which might or might not be the very best way of doing it, but that's what it was. And one mother approached the practitioner and said, "Why is my child not good enough for that research?" And that really hit me hard, because her child had every right, the same as every other child in that group, to be considered for whatever activities were going on. So that gave me a lot of ethical concern at that point. So I don't know if that offers any ideas to consider further, but perhaps other people would like to add to that.
Can I just, sorry. Can I just add something just in terms of communicating with parents and children? It's very important to be transparent and open. And I think in terms, obviously taking into consideration the different contexts, but the pedagogical and the developmental benefits of asking children to talk about their learning are very strong reasons for convincing parents of the benefit of doing this in the class. As I tried to show the developmental benefits and a link to autonomy, developing the child's autonomy, which of course is a long, gradual process, but linked to lifelong learning.
I would like to stress something. Actually, our relationship with children long time establishing. It takes time, as Mary stated, that we need to be patient, and it should be a longitudinal process. So my research usually 1 or 2 years long, and I present physically. My presence in preschool is once in a week, at least 2-3 hours, and I observed the changes in my nature of relationship with children. Some children who were very distant from me and reluctant, openly reluctant to communicate with me, to share their thoughts, their ideas, their beliefs about their agency and their languages. With the time, got closer to me. When I was indeed patient and waited patiently, and also used tips, different kind of cues that I received from gatekeepers, from teachers, primary teachers, their teachers, and teachers' assistants, how to approach children. So recently I tried to summarize all ideas how to approach children, sometimes through their best toy, a lovely toys, or through their favorable book, or through their personal stories that I need to be interested in their personal stories and their personal home background and what happens at home, what they bring to preschool from home. And what I would like to stress that it's a process of being in touch, of getting a rapport, of building rapport with children. It will not be from day to day, from 1 week to another. It takes sometimes 2-3 months to get this report and to be to create truthful relationships. And we need to be patient. And the second point is that it's flexible process. So one day they are open, another day something changed, they have another mood and they came from another leg. So in the morning, and they furious and nervous and not to be in touch and close completely. So I can't do, not actually, I need to be patient and just wait. Thank
I
you.
think, thanks, Mila. I think Sandy already raised her hands, and I saw Nair Ibrahim raising physically her arms, or yes, and Anna Maria just. So maybe we can follow the Fatma. Is it okay?
Yeah.
If you wish to say something, could you please raise your hands in Zoom so that we can physically see it in the right column? Thanks.
Thanks, Beatrice, and a huge thank you to the 4 speakers. It was absolutely fascinating, and I'm just so proud that we're all here listening to you all. It's just fantastic. I just wanted to pick up on the when you go into a context as a researcher and you yourself are aware of the fact that you cannot pressurize the children to say yes, you know, that they are happy to be involved in your research. And I just wanted to share a little bit of experience and then reflect on it. So I was doing some research where because of the setting and the noise within the setting and the difficulty we had with recording, I had to actually do the recording in a room next door to the classroom, which meant that the children had to leave the classroom. And so we organized that fairly formally with the support of the auxiliary staff and the educator. I was working with pre-primary children. And in my mind, I was very clear about the fact that the children would, you know, they could come if they wanted to. That was very clear in my mind. But it wasn't clear in the educator's mind or in the auxiliary staff's mind. And this was my problem really, because I hadn't made it clear to them from the start. And so I found myself in sort of the middle ground here, whereas the children were being prepared to move into another room, but they were also being ordered or made to move in, where in fact, that was not the option at all. That was not the point at all. And so I learned very, very quickly that I had to, what I should have done was made it very clear to the staff themselves how relevant it was that the children wanted to come. And if they didn't, it wasn't a problem. Although it actually was a problem because it completely messed up my research. But I mean, that was, as you've all said, that's the child's right. And I know I had to try and make something out of the mess that evolved from sometimes certain children wanting to come and other times other children wanting to come. But as you say, it's their right. But I think that you know, we might know what is supposed to happen in a research context, but the people that we're working with who are educating the children might not. And so we need to make it really clear to them right from the start. It needs to be part of the preparation for what it is that we are doing and how we're setting up our research. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much. That's very useful. Thank you. Should we go to Nair?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I was just listening. And first of all, thank you to the 4 speakers. I think it was great listening to you and speak about different aspects of children's voices. But I just had I'm just thinking of the dilemma of the researcher or the individual trying to get data from the children and really getting the children's perspectives when they are surrounded by adult gatekeepers. So I think sometimes it's just getting down to the reality that somehow they will always be influenced by those gatekeepers one way or the other. So we need to, that's the dilemma of the researcher in wanting to get the children's voices when you know that that is a fact. I mean, just experiences that I've had is got the children's voices, they signed the consent forms, etc. And then in focus groups with the children, they would tell me, oh, but my mom told me to do this or to say this or to bring this. And I thought, okay, so is this a child's voice or is this the adult voice speaking here? And the reality was, again, I'm having to deal with the adult voice even when I'm only speaking to the children. So I suppose the question is, how do you contextualize the child's voice within the research, and how can you, through the tools that you use, through the multiple tools that you use, try and really get their voice through, the work I've done with Gail as well, in terms of all the different, drawings and objects and different ways of getting their voices, so that you can try and get to the essence of their voice and leave the adult voice somehow at home, I just wanted to say that because I think that's a dilemma that we are always having to deal with in terms of research. So how you contextualize it.
Thank you so much. Amazing. Again, another perspective from which to think about these issues. Thank you so much. We'd go to Anna Maria because you had your hand, and then there is a question that somebody wrote that I'll read. You're muted, Anna Maria.
Right. Yeah, sorry. I'm not used to Zoom because in my university we have to use Teams. So everyone says Zooms is so much better, but I have to look for everything on Zoom. So I also just wanted to offer an anecdote, if you like. I mean, I've got a PhD student who currently working with 5-year-old children doing some research where this is family-based research, actually. So he goes to the child's house once a week, and the research process is longitudinal. And I think this is one of the answers to some of these dilemmas, that the longer you keep going, the more chance you've got that you get deeper and deeper into a young child's world. But this particular situation is really interesting because the parents, even though they've been given copious amounts of information about the research, they all agreed, they all claimed they understood, and they all happy. First of all, they constantly interrupt and interfere with the research. So when this research student is sitting down with activities and tasks and drawings and stuff like that with the young child, both, of course, the parents and even sometimes the siblings get involved. And the student got really, really quite nervous and upset about this. And I said to him, well, look, this is just how it is. You can't fight it. This is the context. You just have to accept. You just have to carry on and see what happens. And now that he's collected all the data from 4 families, and he worked with these families for nearly a year, we can see in the data, it's quite amazing. We can see in the data that it's the data is full of resistance from the children. So they tell him, oh, I need to go now, I need to get a glass of water, or I don't want to do this, or can I show you my maths homework instead, or I'm really tired, this is actually my afternoon downtime. Yeah, I'm happy you're here, but I don't want to do it. So sometimes they pretty overtly resist the task, but sometimes quite subtly, by drawing the adult into some sort of a game or showing them a hopping game they just learned that day or something like that. But when you transcribe all of that data, you begin to see those snippets that really do come where the child really initiates something meaningful about their day at school, about their life, about, you know, in relation to the contact, to the focus of the research. But I'd say 70% of the data is something else. It's about talking to the parents and interfering with what's going on with the siblings, and a lot of very interesting resistance. And a lot of people talk about this in the literature, that resistance is a very clear form of agency. So, you know, we need to be able to recognize this when a child says, well, shall I show you my maths homework, rather than carry on talking about what languages do you speak to who. They say, well, no, can I show you my maths homework? That's actually covert resistance. That's actually saying, I don't want to talk about who I talk to anymore. And this poor PhD student, his topic area is to look at children, multilingual children in early education, so how they cope when they first arrive in a new environment. And I said to him, I suspect they won't want to talk about it. And that is very much what's coming out of the research as well. Why talk about something that was fairly unpleasant, that I didn't understand, I was struggling, I didn't have friends. So very often they immediately change the topic, and they just say, no, it was fine, I was fine. I don't remember. That's the other thing that kids often say, I don't remember. And we just have to accept it. If they don't remember and they don't want to talk about it, then now is certainly not the time to talk about it. But I can see in his longitudinal data, I can see that with 70% of something else, there's 30% of gold in there, gold dust, where you go deeper and deeper to try and understand a young child's point of view about school, about languages, about, but without putting in that effort and that longitudinal design, it's going to be very hard just in a one-off conversation, because we're reminded all the time that even just children fidgeting or looking the other way, or you know, standing up, sitting down, or keeping silent, these are all signs that they don't want to do it. They may not be able to verbalize it that they don't want to do it, of course. So that's the other issue. And you know, and this student explained to the children that all this is because he's doing this big university homework, and the children will be the only ones who can help him. And when that comes up in the context that, would you still like to help me, they always say yes, and 2 seconds later they will refuse to work with the actual task. So there is this ongoing resistance in the data that I guess is their right to, you know, to put on display.
Thank you.
Sorry, it was a slightly long story,
no,
but it's
very,
I think an interesting example to
it's
show.
enlightening and reminding us of the challenges. And I like your reference to the gold dust. And I think that's where we get so excited, thinking all this trouble we've been through, at least there's something so unique in all the data. So that's useful. I will read a question now from Laura, and this is for Gail. And she says, I would like you to tell us more about the interpretation of the information that children give us, how not to overthink it. That's a nice question.
Thanks very much, Laura. Well, and I really also enjoyed what Anna Maria just said, and that out of all the data you can collect, some of it really is gold dust. And I think Nair will agree with me that in the latest research that we did using metaphor with these young children, we got a lot of gold dust. Well, we got like 30% gold dust, and maybe 70% was really not very useful at all, because it was conceptually just beyond a lot of children. And children also respond very, very literally. When we were presenting this study to the children, which was through the senses, and we were trying to ask them to tell us how it, learning English sounds like, learning English feels like to me. So that's another point I wanted to make, that it's really important for the children to understand the purpose of the activity. But with one of the little 4-year-olds, she said, but Madame, l'anglais n'a pas d'oreille. English doesn't have ears, miss. She just couldn't conceptually understand the purpose of what we were trying to do. And even though we tried to explain that if you can tell us what you think about English, how you feel about English, it will help you. So that is one point I'd like to make. But in terms of the interpretation, we go in with our research questions, and we so want to find answers to our research questions that we can not on purpose, but maneuver sometimes the responses to fit our research questions. So I think that's something that we've got to be very, very careful about, and remember that, you know, the children have very limited knowledge of the world. They and as you know, they might be repeating their parents' comments, or they might be just copying somebody else in the class. We've also found that happened a lot. If one child said one thing, another child would copy it. So we've got to be very careful about going into it deeper and analyzing it very carefully. And that's what we were able to do, and to find patterns and categories that formed across the responses that the children gave. I hope that answers, Laura. It's a difficult question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gail. Cassie has her hand up, so please feel free to.
Yeah, well, first, thank you all for this seminar. This has just been wonderful. And I just wanted to sort of comment or sort of raise a question in terms of Nair's point about contextualizing the child's voice. And I just wanted to present a situation because it's one that I'm struggling with now ethically in my research. So I just thought I'd just open the floor. So I have a project now, and that with some of the families, so we're communicating in English, and in some of the families, the parents don't speak a lot of English, but the children can. So it's that sort of classic role reversal of agency of the children can communicate with me just fine, but the parents can't. And then this is heightened by the fact, so the original plan was I would go to the parents' houses, but right now here in Ireland, we can't go outside of 5K, no one can visit each other, so it's all done online. So what happens is that the children, who all speak the majority language, quote unquote, natively, just take the iPad and just talk to me. And it's all going fast, and it's all that beautiful, messy data that you get. And I just worry, I think, then the parents just sort of, you know, just say, okay, the kids are doing their thing, and then just sort of leave, and not necessarily leave, but I don't feel that they're as involved as if I were doing it in person. And so, yeah, so it's just a sort of open-ended question of, you know, the highlights that the sort of the sort of different effects. And this came in Anna Maria's lovely example of the teachers, the other teachers saying, okay, you know, I don't feel, the teachers who then were sort of ostracized within the schools of the things that we don't think of, the sort of other things, the unintentional things. And I just wondered if anyone had any other sort of examples of unintentional things that we don't think about or that don't surface until we actually do the research. Sorry, that was quite long-winded.
Thank you so much. A wonderful contribution.
Yeah.
Moira, maybe perhaps you'd want to.
I think what we're seeing in the last couple of comments and discussions there is the messiness of everyday life. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, parents are highly involved in their children's lives and want to have a fairly strong measure of control over the input the child receives and over the output that the child presents. And in your case there, hi Cassie, how are you? The opposite was happening there. And I'm sure that's quite a common experience for many immigrant parents, in that their children are motoring ahead without any reference in particular to what their parents can understand. So I think, I mean, questions have been discussed, things like being open and transparent about the actual focus of the research. The two questions, the ones that the PhD student had, I think it's fantastic, because we're seeing child agency there written really, really large. And we're seeing how the lives of adults and children intersect and don't intersect, and how for those of us that are passionately interested in language, you know, it's marvelous, but not everybody thinks like that. And we've got to give them the autonomy of having different priorities in their lives, academic or otherwise. But just to revert to the question that Cassie raised there, perhaps there's a role for some element of translation at some point, if that can be arranged either in summary form or whatever. That would have to be negotiated with the children, all depends on their age. But we can't be reporting back to parents what children say unless we have the children's assent at the very least. That we, you know, so there may be some ways of handling this matter through a common language or through translating into some language, or perhaps even working through an intermediary, which I always think is just adding another layer of complexity to all of this.
Yeah, actually, I do have an intermediary. So there is someone who speaks the home language as well, and he comes in with me on the calls. But it's just so funny. I think it was just sort of an example of this is the children's agency, to the point of I'm like, oh gosh, this is so different from the other things I've done, where I don't think I've ever worked with sort of helicopter parents, but where the kids are just completely pushing it. And it's so different. And I just want to make sure that there's never any misunderstanding between myself and the parents of, okay, what's going on here, you know?
Well, so. It just shows how different life has become.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much for that. And
I think just would like to give someone a brief comment that actually we need to think about the interaction between parents' agency and children's language-based agency and teachers' agency. So there are agents in interaction, and they have different agencies, and they have also overlapping between the agencies. So I think we need to approach parents' agency through the family language policy and to look how this agency interacts with what children would like really in their lives. And I would like also to respond to Anna Maria's case of your PhD student. I think that we are not lab studies. We run in most cases ethnographic research, longitudinal field research. So all this mess is actually presence or our experience and our data. Finally, mess are data. Mess is data. So this ecological, as you stressed, Nair stressed, actually ecological background approach is very important. So without this ecology, we can't collect data. It's not, we are not going to measure their experience. It's very difficult to measure their experience. We let their experience by means of quantitative research tools. So all this mess actually is data, what I would like to stress.
Thank you so much, Mila. I just wanted to add to Cassie's example of the children coming on the iPad or, you know, the Zoom, whatever it is. I find that even in my own research, the children are so advanced in using technology and accessing technology that I find that doing it through Zoom is sometimes easier than doing it face-to-face, where they get lazy or they don't really want to do the thing. But when it's online, you know, they send the hearts and the happy things, and so it just it's a different dimension of collecting research from the children. And so if the parents don't already speak the host language, and then the kids do, and then the parents are not so savvy, should we say, with technology, then you have a double layer of agency happening there. So that really, I understand your discomfort in this. So thank you. I should ask Carla, because she has her hand up, to contribute, please. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. First of all, thank you to all the participants for their wonderful talks. Currently, I'm working on my PhD on reading comprehension, and I perform several tasks with a sample of children about this topic. But some of them weren't able to participate because the teacher said that the tasks were going to be too demanding for their current reading level, but they wanted to participate nonetheless. Therefore, I decided to perform a briefer version of my research to see what happened. And yes, due to their low level of reading, they became very frustrated, as the teacher said. But they wanted to do it over and over again. So my question is how to deal with this situation when a child cannot participate in a certain research for reasons such as, in my case, having a low level of reading, but they want to participate and adapting the tasks doesn't work. So I was wondering if anyone had any idea about how to deal with this. Thank you.
Anyone? Mila, Anna Maria.
School-based research. What are ages of your children?
Between 6 and 9.
6 and 9.
Yeah.
Reading comprehension, 6 years old, they're like emerging literacy or first grade students, yes.
It was reading comprehension and meta comprehension about how they perceive their own comprehension. That was it.
Their reflections, their metacognitive experience, actually.
Yeah.
So I think from age 6 we can assess metacognitive experience by means of conversations with children, by means of dialogue with children, by means of also maybe structured questionnaire. But I run research with 7 years old children, and I just talked to them and discussed with them individually and in small groups what I was observed and what I was found during lessons. And they reflect on their literacy experience, biliteracy experience in Arabic and Hebrew during literacy acquisition in both languages. We just run it like discussion. Not like a structured questionnaire. Even so, I was prepared with all questions, but I actually followed their mind, and I actually was led by them during this discussion. And this paper brought very interesting fruits finally, because I realized that I need to go with children and not with my structured questionnaire. So I submitted this paper. I will be glad to share with you these techniques, this discussion, conversational conversation with children that I run with them during about literacy. It was about literacy acquisition in both languages and difficulties. It's metacognitive experience, because metacognitive experience relates to difficulties, challenges.
Yeah.
During some process of literacy acquisition or other process of academic progress.
I'd like to read that research.
With pleasure.
Please.
Mary.
Could I just add that perhaps part of the issue is the gap between the tasks that you, Carla, were trying to get the children to complete and the experiences they had and whatever they were doing in class most of the time. So I'm wondering you know, if you wanted to devise a further test to base it not on your own tasks, but on what the children are doing in class and what they have mastered. And that might give them a chance of succeeding. And then part of the analysis could be between the difference between the two tests, or something like that. But again, it's the same question of trying to start where the children are rather than where we might think they should be. And unless you have been there for a while and unless you have had professional discussions with the teachers and the educators, that's a big ask, but it might be one way of dealing with the problem. I see there's another question here from Fiona. Can I start with Fiona? You've proposed a different context to one that many in the early years would be dealing with when you're dealing with a whole class. And I would feel that your options are more limited regarding children's autonomy when you're dealing with a very large group of children. You could be dealing with 20 or 30 perhaps. So the power dynamic in a situation like that has to be a certain amount of teacher direction. Small group work, I'm sure, is something you've tried as well. But perhaps when you have it all worked out, you can let us know what actually works.
I just think it's
large groups, because it is a different context.
I just think it's an interesting gap in some of the research methods literature, in that it has nearly become sanitized, that you reduce the power dynamic and that you sit on the floor with the children, but then bring children into the context and it becomes a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, but more realistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've been looking at a couple of lovely examples of realistic life, life as it is lived in several contexts there. And I think they're really important lessons to be learned. We were talking about, you know, that being in the 70% of dust. I would think that's worth noting in a more positive light. The fact that the children became disengaged, that they wanted to do other things, that their parents were being excluded, etc. These are lessons for life, just as much as they are for our particular research focus. So we have to try and balance as much as we can within those sets of circumstances.
Thank you so much, Moira. Thank you. Elena, you had a question. If you're here, you can ask Anna Maria straight. Elena? No? Okay, we'll go on.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, good.
Just took some time for me to unmute. Yes, I put a question to Anna Maria. I actually found it very interesting perspective that you took up with differences in the cultural context, and we actually have to reflect upon it. I'm involved in a collaboration project with an African country, and I really find it difficult because the ethical guidelines are different, and the contexts are different. So I, for example, found it really difficult to figure out how my role should be in discussions, for example, with PhD students who are doing research in schools and doing, for example, some classroom observations. We have discussed that according to their ethical guidelines, so it is not required to ask for consent either from the parents or from the children, which I really found, quite unusual, but it is the way it is. And at the same time, I think, well, on the one hand, I think it's difficult to accept it because we know that we need to ask for consent. But on the other hand, I found it really interesting that you said that we really need to see how the macro context, how the cultural context is. So I don't want to put these PhD students in a position that they are in conflict with the social and cultural environment and how it is usually done in the research circles. So I would like you to reflect upon that and probably share more experience with how to find balance between different ethical regulations.
Yeah, okay, I think, yes, I'm not muted. So can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Well, of course, you're opening a can of worms, and I wish there was an easy answer. There isn't. I mean, we come across this all the time as well, especially if you do a PhD study and you're going to submit it to a particular university that has got its own ethical guidelines and ethics committees. Then you have to navigate a very interesting balance between what is ethical and appropriate and feasible in the actual country where you're doing the research, and yet make sure that you get the ethical clearance from the institution where your PhD study is going to be submitted. So I guess I don't really have an answer. I mean, what we tend to recommend to students is to, after getting initial ethical clearance for the study, which is, it has to be done through the university, then it's up to your own conceptions about what you feel is ethical in the given situation, knowing the circumstances and the contextual constraints, and what it is that you can personally sign up to, or you eventually decide not to sign up to. So we had, for example, in India, I'll be very, very honest with you, some of the parents, we couldn't even track them down because in some of the schools, the children live in slums and they're being looked after by other adults and not necessarily their own parents. So is it ethical to endlessly frustrate a child, even just by keep asking the questions, where's your parents, or why aren't they sending a response to us? So even though initially for the project, we said that we would get ethical clearance from all parents in writing, we had to pedal back and say, well, actually, for some parents, it'll be only verbal agreement because they can't read and write. So therefore, it wouldn't be ethical to push them beyond the verbal agreement. And in the case of some children, we couldn't even track down the parents. So what we were very careful about after that, if the child really was very enthusiastic to participate, we had to make sure that that child's picture and data doesn't appear in any published research, because once you publish your research and go to international audiences with your research, you're sort of raising the level to another a degree, if you like. So our compromise was that these children who didn't have the consent form from the parents, neither in writing or in verbal form, we still allowed them to participate in the everyday research activities of the classroom if they wanted to, but we were careful not to publicize their particular outputs and pictures and things that they were very obviously part of in publications. And this is, some of you might shake your heads and say, well, this is no good, but no one really knows what the right answer is to every single ethical dilemma that occurs in a particular context. So I guess the more you can inform yourself about what your choices are, the more you can reflect on what seems ethical for you as a professional in that particular situation. And you just have to make some decisions that sometimes people say that are least problematic. So there's almost never a perfect solution in these scenarios, but there may well be a least problematic solution. And what you decide is a least problematic solution for you in your research might not be the same for another person.
Thank you.
I
Thank you
think
so
the
much.
more we read and the more we understand about research, actually, the more we see the various different dilemmas everywhere. And this is the difference between just seeing it in a report for the ethics committee and actually living it, breathing it every day in the research field.
Thank you
Somebody, I
so
can't
much,
remember who it was, but
Anna
somebody
Maria.
said it's we have to be like living, working, ethical, mindful people. So it's our own ethical consciousness that is probably the most important at the end of the day. Okay, I'll stop
Thank you.
now.
Thank you so much, Anna Maria. We're running out of time. Well, we have a couple of minutes. I would say that afterwards I will be sending an email out for feedback, and we will be putting the speakers' email addresses so you can. Hopefully, I hope this is okay. I'm just saying they can email you. I hope it will be fine. I'm sure they'll be happy to help with to answer any questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. I will now pass it to my colleague Beatrice, who will close the webinar. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, all of you, for being here and sharing this afternoon with us. We are so happy that this webinar has been, it has been so interesting, and so many interesting issues has been raised that I think we will need another couple of hours to continue with the debate, but we need to close it. Thanks to the speakers for accepting our invitations. Thanks to our participants for being here. On behalf of the committee, we just wanted to highlight that we keep on working, and that we are already working on our next webinar, which will be around the beginning of June, mid-June approximately. And I'm very happy and very pleased to communicate that the next, let's say, in physical conference from the network will be in Granada at my university in June 2022. We hope we can all meet, hugs, kiss, and everything there, okay? But we are thinking also of a hybrid event, so that just in case we may need to balance online and physical attendance. Just to let you know that the dates we're thinking of is from the 22nd to the 24th of June 2022. We will send very soon the information about these conferences, which will be organized jointly by Multilingual Childhoods and REYLL SIG Group. So we will embrace both the age from 0 to 6 years old, as well as from 6 years old up to 12 years old. So that's all. I don't want to take you longer. I don't know if Mila wants to add something, or another colleague of mine from the committee. Thanks all for coming, and it's been a real pleasure of having you here.
Thank you for organizing. Thank you, Fatma, for all your efforts to organize this event, to be in touch with all presenters. And I think that we are going to discuss the results, outcomes of our meeting, and maybe we'll continue with this topic. Maybe we'll think about special issue about the child language-based agency and how to collect data from young children and with young children, and how to take into consideration all ethic issues that were raised during this meeting. You are all stars. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.